Welcome to the debate. Have you ever maybe exaggerated just a tiny bit on your resume?
Oh, definitely. Or, just tweaked a job title to make it sound slightly more important.
Right, exactly. Or maybe you've taken just a little more credit for a team project than you strictly deserved. Well, what if I told you that adapting your professional experience for a hiring manager, even when you are being entirely truthful, puts you just one step away from fiction?
I mean, it is a razor-thin line. The moment you start shaping your career history to please an audience, you're playing a very dangerous game with the truth.
And that exact tension is what we're digging into today. We are looking at a specific phase within the living professional record framework, which is the methodology professionals use to document and communicate their career value.
Yeah, and the phase we're examining is called rendering.
Exactly. For anyone who has ever had to write a cover letter or, summarize their career in an interview, rendering is simply the moment your private career history actually meets the public eye. It's the process of turning private data into a public surface.
Right, it's the resume bullet, the LinkedIn bio, the interview answer. It's basically how the world actually sees you.
Yes, and the source material we are looking at provides a very clear foundational directive on how this is supposed to work. It literally states, and I quote, rendering is not invention. Rendering is governed selection.
Which is a heavy phrase. Governed selection.
It is. The text goes on to explain that a rendering is a purpose-specific professional surface created from the living professional record.
That surface may be a resume bullet, LinkedIn paragraph, interview answer, bio, portfolio summary, proposal paragraph, referral message, promotion statement, or public safe summary.
It covers a lot of ground.
It covers everything. But here is the kicker. It says, the advisor does not begin by asking what sounds impressive.
Ah, right. The fatal flaw for most job seekers.
Exactly. Instead, it says, the advisor asks what the record supports, who the audience is, what the purpose is, and what privacy boundary applies. Because rendering makes the record visible, and that visibility must be earned by source discipline.
It really is a fascinating mandate. But it brings up a profound tension that we're going to debate today. Where does the true power of a professional rendering actually come from?
Right, because I look at this framework and I see a system entirely anchored in source discipline. I mean, the supreme principle here is strict governance. The value of your resume relies entirely on its absolute, unyielding accountability to the underlying evidence.
I don't know if I agree with entirely, though.
Well, I argue that the moment you prioritize the audience's reaction over the reality of your source material, you drift into generic professionalism, or worse, outright invention.
See, I come at it from a different way. When you read that core doctrine, rendering is governed selection, I'd argue the operative word there isn't governed, it is selection.
Okay, explain that. Why selection?
Because every single time you create a professional surface, by definition, you are leaving almost everything out. You are making a highly subjective choice. The material repeatedly forces you to ask, what version of the truth belongs here?
But it's still a version of the truth.
Yeah, but that question alone acknowledges that professional truth is not some monolithic, static object. It changes shape based on who is looking at it. The true power lies in audience-specific selection, the active interpretive process of omitting and shaping how the truth is perceived.
I mean, it changes shape, sure, but it absolutely does not change substance. Let's look at how this system actively prevents the kind of inflation that plagues modern hiring.
Okay, go ahead.
The framework uses a series of strict readiness gates. They're basically stress tests, right? To force you to prove your claims before you are even allowed to draft a single sentence for the market.
Right, you have to identify proof gaps.
Exactly. If you want to claim you're a strategic leader, but your record only shows you managing a shared inbox, well, the system stops you. The rendering must be a direct, governed translation. It answers only to what the record can prove.
But the shape dictates the meaning for the reader. Think about the surfaces themselves. A resume bullet is designed to compress information into a tiny visual space, right?
Yes, extreme compression.
But an interview answer is designed to expand that information into a compelling human narrative. A LinkedIn profile is designed to explain your value to a broad network. These surfaces are fundamentally different from one another because the audiences are different.
Well, yes, the audience dictates the format.
If strict source discipline were the only thing that mattered, we would just export our raw career databases and hand those massive spreadsheets to recruiters.
But we don't do that because
We don't. We curate. We select. And that act of curation is the entire ballgame, in my opinion.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on how compression actually works in this framework, because I think it proves my point about source discipline being the anchor. Let's look at the mechanics of a resume bullet.
Okay, let's look at it.
The text describes it as an act of extreme compression. You have a very specific structure, an action, a scope, a context, and a result.
Right, it's a very tight formula.
But it's not just a formula for readability. It is a structural restraint against inflation. Let's use the materials example of an onboarding checklist. Without governance, a professional might write, led strategic onboarding transformation to drive operational excellence.
Which, let's be honest, sounds incredibly impressive to a corporate audience.
But it means absolutely nothing. It is pure, generic professionalism. It's empty calories.
Fair enough.
Now look at how the governed rendering handles that exact same project. It says, created shared onboarding checklist during high turnover, coordinating manager input to improve consistency for new hires.
It's much more grounded, yeah.
Notice the ownership verbs, created, coordinated. It explicitly refuses to use the words transformed or led because the source evidence just doesn't support them. The compression mechanism relies entirely on accurate verbs. The truth is protected because the surface refuses to bend to the audience's desire for grandiosity.
That is a compelling argument. But have you considered what happens next?
What do you mean?
Well, compression is only half the ecosystem. The other half is what the material calls interview rehydration. And this is where the idea of a strict static source gets incredibly complicated.
Walk me through that. How does rehydration complicate the source truth?
Because an interview answer takes that highly compressed bullet-created, shared onboarding checklist and has to expand it back out into a full narrative. The framework explains that rehydration brings back the situation, the constraint, the decision, the action, and the change.
Right, you're telling the story behind the bullet.
But you have to reconstruct a story for human belief. You have to sit in a chair, look a hiring manager in the eye, and read the room. If the interviewer is laser-focused on cross-functional alignment, you are going to emphasize the coordinating manager input aspect of the story.
Okay, sure.
But if they are stressed about crisis management, you emphasize the high turnover constraint. Rehydrating a bullet requires the speaker to adapt to the audience in real time. That is an exercise in extreme malleability. You are actively shaping the reality of the work to fit the psychological needs of the person across the table.
Wait. So if I'm a listener trying to update my LinkedIn today or, prepping for an interview next week, are you saying I shouldn't tailor my profile? Because it sounds like you're equating adaptation with the malleability of facts.
I'm saying the adaptation is the value.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning. You can tailor a message without rewriting history. Think of rehydration like freeze-dried coffee.
Freeze-dried coffee? Okay, I'm listening.
The resume bullet is the freeze-dried crystal. All the water, all the heavy context has been meticulously removed for the sake of efficient transport.
Right.
When you sit in the interview chair, you add the water back, but you are bringing back the original substance, the actual constraint you faced, the actual decision you made. You are not brewing a completely different bean just because the interviewer happens to prefer tea. The core substance remains absolutely governed by reality.
I love the analogy, I really do. But let's push it a step further to see where it breaks down.
By all means, push it.
When you add the water back to that freeze-dried coffee, the temperature of the water, the shape of the cup you serve it in, the ratio of water to crystal, all of those variables change the experience of the coffee entirely for the person drinking it.
I mean, presentation matters, yes, but
Let me ask you this. If rehydration allows for dynamic storytelling, doesn't that inherently risk the very inflation the system warns against? If a candidate is actively shaping the narrative to please the interviewer's specific anxieties, aren't we just one tiny step away from invention?
No, because their rehydration is still strictly bounded by their record. The material is incredibly explicit about this. An interview answer must rehydrate their record, not the candidate's ego.
But if they embellish just a little?
If the candidate sits in that room and says, I brought all the senior managers together in a room and forced them into alignment because they were dysfunctional, but the private record shows they just sent a polite email gathering feedback, they have broken the governance. They have lied. The discipline holds the line between tailoring and fiction.
Okay, but your freeze-dried coffee analogy ignores a massive complication in professional life. What happens when the original bean is strictly confidential?
Privacy.
Yes. Let's look at the mechanics of privacy and context omission, because this is where the idea of an objective, static truth really starts to fracture. The material dedicates significant time to public safe rendering.
Yes, which is a critical component of privacy governance. You obviously can't just dump proprietary company data onto the internet.
Exactly. Some of a professional's most valuable, complex work is private or highly regulated. So the framework instructs you to strip out identifying details. The text gives a great example. A private record might document that a professional, quote, coordinated documentation for a confidential healthcare client implementation involving internal workflow changes, patient intake data, and billing process review.
Highly sensitive stuff. You cannot put patient intake data or billing specifics on a public LinkedIn profile.
Right, so the public safe rendering becomes supported documentation coordination during a regulated healthcare implementation, helping clarify workflow updates for internal stakeholders.
A perfectly governed selection. But look at what we've done. We have removed the client name. We have removed the patient data. We have removed the billing details. Now, I understand exactly why we do this mechanically, but we have to acknowledge what is happening to the truth here. By intentionally stripping out those specific constraints, we are creating an abstracted reality.
It abstracts the exposure, not the reality.
I'm sorry, I just don't buy that it's a seamless one-to-one translation. Let me offer a different analogy. If I'm a photographer and I take a picture of a beautiful landscape, but I intentionally crop out a massive, terrifying storm cloud gathering on the left side of the frame.
Okay.
I haven't invented a new tree. I haven't photoshopped in a fake mountain. Every pixel in the photo is true, but I have completely changed the mood and the meaning of the photograph for the viewer.
That's an interesting way to look at it.
Right? When we omit a severe project constraint to protect a client's privacy, aren't we actively curating a rosier, or at least a fundamentally different, version of the truth?
That's an interesting point, though I would frame the causality entirely differently. You aren't cropping out the storm cloud to deceive the viewer. You are cropping it out because you do not have the legal or privacy consent to publish the storm.
But the effect on the viewer is the same.
The methodology demands that privacy is part of professional truth. Evidence is not exposure. And more importantly, omitting the client's name or the billing specifics does not change the core metrics of the work you actually performed.
But it definitely changes how the work is perceived.
Let me explain why it doesn't change the underlying value, though. The material makes a crucial mechanical distinction between a measure of performance, which is just scale or volume, like, trained 6 cohorts, and a measure of effectiveness, which is what actually changed in the business, like improved consistency.
Right. The qualitative value.
Exactly. When you create a public safe rendering, you rely on supported qualitative value. You might say, maintained weekly issue tracker that improved visibility for the project team. You haven't invented a fake percentage to replace the confidential billing data. You haven't made up a number.
True, you haven't lied.
You have relied on strict source discipline to find a truth that is both safe and perfectly accurate. Why does a measure of effectiveness build trust with a recruiter? Because it proves you understand your business value. A measure of performance just proves you were busy. The discipline saves you from the manipulation your photographer analogy implies.
It saves you from outright lying, yes, I will grant you that. But we are still left with the reality that the audience's needs, in this case a public audience that simply cannot be trusted with confidential data, dictated the final shape of the rendering. The audience governs the selection. The selection is the active ingredient.
But the source governs what is even available to be selected. Let's look at the ultimate test of this system, which is, frankly, the most modern challenge to professional communication today: AI-assisted rendering.
Oh, wow. Yeah, generative AI.
If there was ever a place where audience-pleasing adaptation could run completely wild, it is generative AI.
Oh, absolutely. Generative AI is the ultimate crowd pleaser. I mean, it is an engine built to hallucinate competence.
Precisely. Left to its own devices, AI wants to make a junior coordinator sound like a titan of industry. If your record says, managed an Excel tracker for 3 people, the AI will rewrite it as spearheaded enterprise-wide data visualization strategy, driving operational synergies.
Which is hilarious, but a disaster for truth.
Exactly. But look at how this framework handles AI mechanically. It is entirely defensive. It is entirely rooted in source discipline.
Because it has to be.
Yes, you can only use AI with what the methodology calls safe source packets. You explicitly engineer the prompt to restrict the AI. You tell it, do not invent metrics, do not inflate verbs, use created and coordinated only if the source text supports it.
So you're locking it down.
You are putting a chokehold on the AI's ability to adapt to the audience. You tell it to avoid words like transformed unless there's explicit proof.
The constraints on the generation are very tight. Yes.
And it doesn't stop at the prompt. Once the AI spits out a draft, you have to run it through a rigorous review checklist. You have to ask, what specific source entry does this claim come from? Is the ownership verb completely accurate? Was AI drift introduced?
Did it sneak in words like spearheaded?
Right.
Right.
The entire architecture of the system is inherently suspicious of generated text. It trusts nothing but the underlying evidence. This proves that the system believes the audience's desire for a polished narrative is actually a threat to be managed, not the goal to be optimized.
I don't disagree that the review mechanics are robust. They have to be. But you are looking at the creation of the rendering as the final step in the process. I look at what happens after the rendering is created.
What do you mean?
Let's talk about the life cycle of a surface once it hits the market, because I think this proves the audience is actually in charge. The material mandates that professionals maintain a rendering bank.
Right. The repository where you store your approved resume bullets, bios, and interview answers.
Right. And the material explicitly states that you must track feedback logs and revision notes in this bank. Why? Because professional surfaces go stale.
They do.
Let's say you take that perfectly governed AI-checked resume bullet about the issue tracker, and you send it into the market. A recruiter reads it and fundamentally misunderstands your role. Or an interviewer asks a follow-up question that reveals your context was too vague for them to grasp the complexity of what you actually did. What does the framework instruct you to do then?
It tells you to record the feedback, note what confused the reader, and revise the rendering to be clearer.
Impetus for the revision comes entirely from the market's reaction. The fact that professional surfaces require constant revision based on recruiter or interviewer feedback proves that the source truth just isn't enough on its own.
I wouldn't say it's not enough.
A perfectly governed statement that confuses the reader is useless. It is a dialogue, not a monologue. If the audience doesn't understand the rendering has failed, no matter how much source discipline you applied in drafting it. The market dictates the revision. Therefore, the audience ultimately governs the rendering just as much as the source does.
I see the appeal of that argument. I really do. But it conflates clarity with compromise.
How so?
Yes, we revise based on market feedback. If a recruiter misunderstands a bullet about an issue tracker, we clarify the language. We provide better context. But we do not change the underlying claim. We do not suddenly claim we built the software for the issue tracker just because the market happens to be looking for a software engineer this week.
No, of course not.
The revision is an attempt to achieve a better interpretation of the exact same truth. The framework explicitly warns against this. It says, do not revise only for polish. Revise for better interpretation. The anchor is still the source.
But interpretation is a two-way street, and it relies heavily on the psychology of the reader. Let me bring up a specific anxiety the material anticipates from professionals. A person might worry, is it dishonest to have 3 different versions of my resume?
Which is a very common fear. People feel like they are being two-faced.
And how does the framework respond? It says, different renderings can be truthful when they come from the same governed source and serve different audiences. Let's go back to our onboarding checklist one last time. The resume rendering says, created shared onboarding checklist. It's dry, it's compressed, it proves competence.
Yes.
But the LinkedIn rendering might say, I help teams turn scattered practices into clearer tools. That's a thematic statement of professional identity. And then the interview rendering is a 5-minute narrative about managing conflicting personalities during a period of high turnover. These three surfaces look radically different. They feel different to the listener.
But they do not contradict one another. They are perfectly aligned.
They don't contradict, but you cannot tell me they are all just the exact same thing translated differently. The medium and the audience fundamentally change what the thing is. The LinkedIn version appeals to a networking contact's desire for high-level philosophy. The interview version appeals to a hiring manager's desire for conflict resolution.
True.
The true art of this methodology isn't just cross-checking facts against a spreadsheet like an auditor. It is the deeply human, highly subjective art of making raw data human believable. And what is believable changes depending on who is listening.
Human believable is a fantastic phrase. But belief is incredibly dangerous if it isn't tethered to reality. You can make an audience believe you are a visionary leader, but if you don't have the skills to back it up on day one of the new job, that belief will absolutely destroy your reputation.
Well, sure, which is why you don't invent.
Right, which is why source discipline must remain the supreme principle. Yes, you adapt to the audience. Yes, you select the appropriate context. But the boundaries of that selection are entirely dictated by the reality of your private record. You cannot rehydrate a constraint in an interview that you didn't actually face in real life.
Agreed.
You cannot claim a measure of effectiveness you didn't actually achieve. The final rule of the module, the closing thought the material leaves us with, is unequivocally restrictive. It says, render only what the record can support, only for the audience that needs it, only with the privacy boundary attached. The support comes first. It is the foundation.
The support comes first chronologically, yes, I'll give you that. But the utility, the actual movement of trust through the professional world, which is the whole point of a networking message or a proposal paragraph, relies entirely on the selection.
But without the source,
A perfectly disciplined rendering that fails to resonate with the human being reading it is a dead artifact. It is safe, but it is entirely useless. The source provides the raw clay, I will grant you that, but the audience determines the shape of the vessel.
we have arrived at a fascinating impasse, and I think it really highlights the enduring complexity of how we communicate our value in the modern workplace. To summarize our positions, I maintain that the integrity, the safety, and the ultimate value of any professional surface, whether it is a highly compressed resume bullet or a meticulously constrained AI draft, stems entirely from its strict, disciplined tether to your actual career history. The surface is not the source, and it must never forget that.
And I maintain that while the source provides the necessary raw material and boundaries, the true art and utility of rendering is found in audience-aware selection, the acts of compression, strategic omission, and real-time interview rehydration are what takes static, lifeless data and make it human believable and purposeful.
I think where we absolutely converge is on the foundational doctrine of the material. Rendering is not invention. We both agree that resume inflation, generic professionalism, and AI hallucinations are severe hazards that must be actively managed.
Agreed entirely. We both acknowledge that answering the central question, what version of the truth belongs here, for this audience, for this purpose, from this record, is the mandatory starting point for any professional communication.
There is much more to explore in this material, particularly in how these concepts are practically executed when building drafts. The tension between protecting the reality of your source and adapting to the needs of your audience is not a math problem to be solved. It is a permanent balancing act that requires constant, thoughtful governance.
It really is. It is a tension every professional must navigate every single time they introduce themselves or hit submit on a job application.
Which leaves us with this final thought. A resume isn't a history of what you did. It's a strategically constrained map of what you can do for a specific reader. The map must be readable to the hiker, or they will surely get lost. But if the map maker moves a mountain just to make the drawing look more appealing, the hiker walks off a cliff. As you go out into your own professional landscape, how are you balancing the rugged terrain of your actual record with the needs of the person trying to read your map? Thank you for listening to the debate.